Hello everyone and welcome to the latest edition of Book Time with Elvis with me, Mark. And Elvis is here too, though he's sleeping after our walk. It's almost 11 o'clock on Saturday morning here in the Czech Republic, and I've got the lights on. It's a really dark, grey, horrible day. So what better thing to do than to make a video? And actually I picked up the gauntlet laid down by Mr Donaghue last night at my time. To make another tag over the weekend, and that I have done. Of course I will tag some people in it, but I'm sure there's a bit of a backlog at the moment, so by all means take your time in doing it, next week, the week after, whenever suits you, it's fine. And regarding this tag, it's quite a long one actually. I apologize for that. There are 15 prompts. Feel free, of course, to ignore any of them. Certainly if you think they are personal, because that is the theme really, I suppose, of this tag. As Daniel at Guilty Feet thinks I'm on some kind of nefarious mission to get hold of everybody's personal details. He might be right. You never know. No, seriously, it's just, it's nice to get to know people and discuss different things. So the tag I've come up with is one that I've called a somewhat autobiographical tag, and a series of questions based around ourselves. And so let's go through it. Let's have a look at number one. Number one, what was the number one best-selling book, fiction and or non-fiction, on the day you were born, and have you read them? So luckily I went on the internet to find this out, because I was born. I didn't know what that book was. I was quite surprised to see that the book was The Bourne Identity by Robert Ludlum. Was the fiction number one bestseller. I went with the New York Times bestseller list because it seems to be one of the ones best documented. You can of course choose any one from your home country or whatever. It'd be interesting, whatever you choose. So yeah, The Bourne Identity by Robert Ludlum. And I haven't read it. No, I have seen the film. I'm sure the book is better. And maybe I will read it. And actually the non-fiction book I haven't read either, is called Thy Neighbour's Wife by someone called Gay Talese. And its subtitle is How American Sexuality Has Changed in Our Time. And as I said, I haven't read it. Have you? Let me know. Number two. What are some books, series or standalones that immediately spring to mind when you think of your childhood? I know similar questions have been around before, but maybe it'll give you a chance to talk about ones you haven't mentioned. And I have mentioned a few times Treasure Island, so I won't mention it now. And when I was making the question, I did actually come up with quite a few that popped quite quickly into my mind. One of them is a book called The Tale of Georgie Grubb by Jean Willis. And I don't know if you know this book. It was quite a funny book, and I used to love it as a kid. Mr Donaghue, you might appreciate this one. It's all about poor personal hygiene. You started it. I never said anything. So it's all about poor personal hygiene in this boy called Georgie Grubb, and he did everything he could to avoid getting clean. And I think, if I remember rightly, he ends up being thrown away with the rubbish. So it's quite horrific, actually, the ending, but it was one I used to absolutely love. When I was a kid, I'd always have my mum or grandmother or whoever read it to me. The next ones I was thinking of, one of them is one called The Great Smile Robbery by Roger McGuff. And this was a book about a group of funny-looking gangsters who stole smiles from a bank. I think they were kept in a bank vault. And I always remember there was one character in it called Mrs. Wobblebottom. She was a big fat lady in the drawings and the illustrations in that book, and he gave her the name Mrs. Wobblebottom, and I used to really enjoy this book. I don't really remember the ins and outs now, but yeah, it was quite funny. And then others were things like Tintin, Asterix, Lucky Luke, and the Choose Your Own Adventure series. But one series that really stuck in my mind from my childhood is, I don't know if any of you read him, probably you did, was the author Willard Price and his adventure series. I used to really like these. They were about two brothers who would travel the world following their father because of his work, and they would always get involved in some form of adventure. So there were things like underwater adventure, Arctic adventure, safari adventure, or African adventure, something like that. And they were brilliant. I need to somehow see if I can find them again. I really enjoyed those. So yeah, those are some of the that stick in my mind. Number 3, school days, the best days of your life apparently, but while you were there, you were forced to read some books that maybe you wouldn't have chosen for yourself. What are some of those books that you enjoyed? I was thinking about this. Obviously, things like Shakespeare or whatever spring to mind, but the two that really stick in my mind were by the same author. And it would have been in the mid-90s. I think the books were written earlier, but we read them in the mid-90s at school. And it was Michelle Magorian, and she wrote 2 books that really stuck in my mind, and I probably wouldn't have read them if I hadn't been forced to. One was Goodnight, Mr Tom, which was about an inner-city London child who was evacuated because of the Blitz and sent to live in the country with a man called Mr Tom. And it was quite upsetting book because I believe the boy did suffer from abuse at his home in London, but it was it's a nice book. Yeah, it's probably worth reading if you can get hold of it. And the other one she wrote was one called Back Home, and this was the story of a girl whose father returned from the war, and it was kind of like how it had affected him and affected their relationship together. But those 2 really stick in my mind, and they were actually ones I was really glad I read. Number 4, were you independent as a child or part of a pack when you were at school? Did you join in the reading fads of the day, or did you just stay away and do your own thing? I would say that I was fairly independent, pretty much stuck to my own thing. I remember lots of my schoolmates or whatever would read certain sci-fi books that perhaps I wasn't really interested in. Another series I remember everybody reading, which I never did, was, I think it was something like the Soldier A to Z series, and they followed like special forces soldiers, like from the SAS or SBS, and it was like Soldier A, and he would go on some mission and do something. They might have been based on true accounts, I can't remember, but I never really got into them. So I would kind of read my own things, really. Maybe some kind of classics, trying to look more intelligent perhaps, or even books from my parents, as opposed to reading what a lot of the other children were reading at the time. Number 5, as you moved into your turbulent teens, can you remember your first experience encountering sex in a book? I suppose by this I mean maybe a novel, because it's the one that sticks in my mind. Thing is, I don't remember the name of the book. Maybe somebody else does, and if you recognise it from my description, maybe let me know, because I seem to remember the book was good, aside from the sex in it, but it was the first time I really encountered sex in a book. And I was on holiday with my family in Portugal. I must have been only about 11, maybe 12, and the place we were staying had a library. And I was attracted by this book because of the cover. It had I think there's a book called The Iron Cross. I don't think it's that one, but it had something like a World War II Eastern Front cover that looked really, to a 12-year-old boy, very exciting. And so I took it, and I remember reading it in the car when we were driving somewhere on the way to do some sightseeing or whatever. And, suddenly there was like these sex scenes in it. I didn't know what to do. I felt really naughty reading it because, my parents are sitting in the front, my sister's sitting next to me. I hadn't any idea that such a thing would be in this book. And I remember thinking, oh my God, this is, either the most exciting thing I've ever read, or, it was strange. But it was set on the Eastern Front during the Second World War, and it was about German soldiers. And there was, as I said, it seemed to be quite a lot of sex in it. So yeah, if you know what it is, just purely out of interest, please perhaps let me know below. Number 6, what are some of the first kinds of non-fiction you encountered? Well, for me, that I would have actually picked up and read would have been things like history, because as I learned more and more history in school, I became very interested in it and started seeking out books about it on my own. Of course, there would have been other things like atlases and encyclopedias and things like that. But as I say, history definitely. War was something I was very interested in as a small boy. Of course, now I look at it in a different way. And actually, I had a weird obsession with Zulus and the Zulu War, because when I had chickenpox, I first came into contact with the old film Zulu, and it remains actually one of my favourite films. I know it's a bit, of course, controversial, but I like to think that it kind of, for a film of its time, it's quite sympathetic, and I think portrays the positives and negatives of both sides, really. But anyway, I became obsessed with this as a topic, and I was able, as a kid, to buy a load of specialty military history books about it. Some of these big ones with pictures and things in, and I just found the whole thing really interesting. So these were kind of my first encounters with non-fiction. Next. Number 7. Whose bookshelf was more fun to raid, mum's or dad's? Of course, that's assuming that your parents had different tastes in reading. Mine did. Certainly when I was younger. My father read a lot of books about aviation, books like The Right Stuff or biographies of Chuck Yeager. And, we were living in Bermuda during my young childhood. And there was a lot of things like baseball on TV, and he started reading these books about the sport of baseball, none of which really interested me. So my mum's books were probably more up my alley. She was into things like true crime, and at the time, maybe Jack the Ripper and this kind of thing. And she was really interested in, well, not really interested in, but she had, I remember, some books by the English author Leslie Thomas. And I picked up a few of his books and read them, even though I was quite young. I can't remember the name of the one that really sticks in my mind about. Again, it was about the Second World War, and it was about like sending submarines into New York. It was a spy thriller. It was really good. I really enjoyed it, but I should really have researched it, I suppose. But I'm sure the wonderful thing with this is someone go, oh yeah, it was such and such. So there we go. These days things have changed. I would say the three of us have quite a similar taste in books. My sister's a little bit different. She likes her own things more, whereas I find that my mother, father and I, we tend to trade books back and forth or recommend things to each other. I mean, we're all big fans of the Shard Lake series. I started reading Aubrey Maturin because my father recommended them. Definitely now it's kind of more even, I suppose, that we're able to make recommendations to each other. Number 8, how diverse is your library? And what I did here was I stole from Amazon the general list of genres and things for books, and obviously you don't have to go through them all, but I'm just curious, maybe what from these general genres have you got in your library? I went through it and I found I have quite a diverse amount, I would say. I have around 25 of the categories listed, and it would have been easy to say what I didn't have, I suppose. But for example, I don't have any young adult books, I don't have any university textbooks, and I don't have any erotica. I'm not a prude or anything, I just happen to not have any. So there we go. Number 9, what types of books do you find most difficult to discuss? For me, I think it's any book really pertaining to race, and it's not because I find necessarily the topic itself to read about, but I'm very conscious of always being careful not to offend people if I speak about it, because when you hear about all these discussions, it's always the middle-aged white men who are seen to have all this privilege, and therefore I feel that if I start talking about something like this, it's always going to sound maybe patronizing or condescending to people, and I certainly wouldn't want to offend anyone, and totally would never do so deliberately anyway. I do find the topic of race and this very interesting, but it's not, as I say, something I really feel comfortable discussing because, one slip of the tongue or I don't mean by saying any really controversial words, but maybe, using in some form wrong terminology or trying to justify things in the wrong way, or maybe just not even getting my point across properly, makes me cautious about discussing it. So I think that's a bit of a shame because maybe a lot of people feel like I do and therefore shy away from discussing it, whereas it would be better maybe if it was more out in the open, especially among my demographic. Perhaps, I don't know. I mean, you might just all be thinking, what a load of rubbish, but that's what I feel anyway. It's my humble opinion on the matter. Number 10, in what way do your life experiences and emotions shape your choice of reading? I'm definitely a mood reader. I find that I usually have to read something that suits my current mood. Actually joining BookTube and trying to take part in some of these themed months has been quite difficult for me because, by announcing what I was reading, I was kind of locked in, where normally I would either choose something off my reading list or just pick something random up, whatever I felt like. But I think this has been good for me as it's kind of distracted me from what I would normally, or my normal reading habit. It's kind of pushed me a little bit out of my comfort zone, which is good. And I would say, for example, I spent most of my life abroad and, be it traveling on holidays or living abroad. And certainly that has influenced what I read. I as I said, I grew up in Bermuda, and actually I have one book, quite old now, from my childhood that my parents sent me, which my grandmother gave me, which is a fictional story based around the first settlers to the islands of Bermuda. And I would never have read it had I not been in Bermuda. I'd never come across it. And the same goes for other books, based around my time in Asia, or even the Czech authors and things I've touched on since I've lived in the Czech Republic. So certainly those experiences have in some form shaped my my reading. Okay, next one. In much the same way as our taste for food changes, so perhaps as our taste in books. How would you say your own reading tastes have evolved over the decades? Mine have fluctuated, definitely. I started off reading, of course, children's fiction, novels, and then when I kind of entered my teenage years and young adult life, I went very heavily non-fiction. I started to get back into fiction when I was living in Japan, so around the age of 25, because I was with another smaller group of expats, English teachers who were out there, and we traded books, so I couldn't be very picky, and I picked up James Clavell for the first time, and his books really got me back into reading fiction again. For years I avoided historical fiction, because I was such a big fan of real historical books. I thought, they could never be as good or whatever, but it seems I was wrong. When I started reading C.J. Sanson's Shard Lake series, which Steve mentioned the other day, this really pulled me into historical fiction, and I really enjoy it. I start to realize that there's a lot of historical fact within a lot of the historical fiction, and the stories are just a way or a medium for them to kind of give you those facts in perhaps a more interesting way, which was good. And certainly I find that I'm becoming a much more open-minded reader as I get older, and certainly since I've been on BookTube, the same thing. Every day watching everybody else's videos, my mind is open to so many suggestions. Sometimes we feel down, unfortunately. It's just one of those things, and I just wondered, when you do feel sad or down, have you got a go-to book to kind of raise yourself up or bring yourself back up? For me, Three Men in a Boat, which I've already mentioned, is one of my favourite books of all time, and also anything by P.G. Wodehouse. I find him very amusing, and definitely if I'm in a blue mood, he helps. More modern writer would be Alexander McCall Smith. Generally brings me up as well, so that would be my answer to that. Now, number 13 is a bit difficult. You can discard it. I mean, for some of us it's easier than others. Maybe I only have to choose four books. Maybe poor old Steve Donaghue might have to go for 8 or 9 books. But basically, if you had to choose one book or author to kind of sum up each decade of your life, who or what would they be? Now, of course, as I said, this is very difficult. But if I think back and think like which were the authors or the books that really stick in my mind for particular decades, I did come up with a list. For the 1980s, it would be Roald Dahl, specifically his book The Witches. For the 1990s, I go with Sue Townsend's Adrian Mole books. Now, obviously, I read a lot more in the later part of the 90s, but in those formative teenage years, I found the Adrian Mole books to be really great. And if you haven't read them or don't know about them, check them out. I think an adult can read them just as well as a child. In the 2000s, I've gone for the author Giles Milton, who writes, I think, very interesting, slightly unpopular history. I mean, he doesn't choose obvious things generally. He's written some great books on history. He's a very good narrative history writer. I particularly love his book Samurai William, about the first Englishman who went to Japan. He's written other books about Big Chief Elizabeth, so the history of English exploration / exploitation in North America. And he's written loads of great books. I think there's not been one that I haven't enjoyed. And then for the teens of the last decade, I went with C.J. Sampson and his Shard Lake series. Fantastic. It made that decade for me, I can say. I mean, of course, there are many others, but it doesn't really matter what you say. It's just kind of giving a taste of what you read from those times. I think the books themselves don't have to be from those decades. It's just when you read them. So Adrian Mole books were written in the 80s, but I read them in the 90s. A lot of Roald Dahl was in the 70s, but I read them in the 80s. So, it's how it fits in for you personally, I think it's fair to say. Number 14. Of course, everyone is entitled to their own opinions, but how do you feel when people say reading is boring, and what do you say in defense of reading? Well, on a personal level, I think such people are crazy, and of course dead wrong, but I'm usually a very polite person, and certainly wouldn't be quick to, tell them this, but I would gently advise them that I think they're wrong, and that through reading they would have the chance to learn so many amazing and wonderful things, also experience many different types of adventures, and live multiple lives. Perhaps it's a slightly cliched answer, but I do believe that, and that surely these things could never be considered boring. That's what I would tell them. And the last question, the last prompt, number 15. What was the number 1 selling book on the day of your most recent birthday, fiction and or non-fiction, and have you read them? So for me, my last birthday, my 40th birthday last summer, one of them, the fiction one, was 28 Summers by Ellen Hildebrand. I haven't read it. And the non-fiction was How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi, which I haven't read as well, but I'm curious to do so. So I hope you enjoyed that. I hope it wasn't too long. I hope it wasn't delving too much or expecting to delve too much into all your personal lives, but I hope you got something from that. And of course, it remains to me to tag people. As I say, take your time when you do it. I know there's a lot on for a lot of people. And if I haven't tagged you, it's nothing personal. Feel free to do it anyway. I just decided to tag the following people. Obviously, de facto, I will tag the shirtless Zoom warrior Steve Donaghue. I tag also Sina at Beating Around the Books, Vian at Revenant Reads, Mark Nash, Marilyn Maya Mendoza, the Baby Boomer booktuber, that's correct, and Hannah's books. So that's who I tag, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much for staying with me till the end. If you did, if you didn't, then you don't know what I'm saying anyway, so it doesn't matter. But I wish you all well. Have a great weekend, and see you all soon. All the best. Stay healthy.